I was glad to be moving. I never liked my city. It was too loud for me anyway. I looked around at my family members in the car. My parents were up front, chatting cheerfully away at what our new town would be like. My father, who was driving the curves of the street carefully, was offered a lawyer position at the town that paid him double what he made back in the city. My mother, an antique store owner, was happy to be able to open up a bigger antique shop in our new town. My brother, sitting quietly beside me, had his headphones plugged into his ear as usual. He was only a year older than me, a senior in high school. He was the only person in the car that felt bitter about our move. The move into our new house went by quickly. The move trucks came the next day and we got down to business. It took us about 2 weeks to fully move into the house. The house was big and beautiful. My father was so happy we could afford it. My mother loved the fact that it was so old. Our antique geek side loved everything about the house. My brother hasn't really spoke since we got there. He just shuffled around the house in a sour mood that he took on since he heard we were moving. Myself? I thought it was pretty rad. My room was huge, and I was able to put everything in its place. It didn't even matter that the floorboards were creaky. The house was the last house on a large street, far away from the city. Beside us was another large house, and beside that another. All three houses were very aged, and there was a tremendous amount of space between them. My father loved the amount of acres we had. He had plans to build a nice shed and bring in some farming material. We have to fit in with the rest of the town, don't we? He always joked. Fast forward. It was our 4th week into the house. The summer air was dry and the sun beat down on the window of my room. It was an absolutely beautiful day, and I was excited to go into town. I got up and had breakfast. My mum had baked muffins and fed us bacon. I always loved her cooking. I got upstairs and hopped into the shower. I cranked the radio up high and sang loudly as I showered. I was in an excellent mood. I hopped out of the shower and started to towel dry my hair. Suddenly, I heard a tapping at the bathroom window. A bird? No, that couldn't have been it. My bathroom window was somewhat small, and it was one of the faded ones. You know, the kinds of the windows that you couldn't see out of. I opened the window a bit and found a tree branch hitting itself against the window. I glanced behind it. Rain. Lots of it. It was so ugly outside. Where did the beautiful sun go? That dry, crisp air was replaced with a gloomy, sad atmosphere. Despair continued to wash over me as I continued to look outside as I got dressed. Our day plans were ruined. Everyone stayed inside that day. We found things to do. We cleaned the kitchen and reorganized the living room to look better. My brother even helped for the first time. We'll go to town tomorrow. This is probably just a summer storm, my dad reassured me. I got into bed that night, praying that we could all go out tomorrow. The next morning hit me like a ton of bricks. I woke up in a daze, sticky with sweat. The sun shined in my room, leaving a rainbow pattern on my ceiling. It was another beautiful day. I felt horrible. Cold sweat ran down my legs and my head was pounding. I decided to sleep a little longer. I hoped if I woke up again, maybe the headache would pass. I woke up 3 hours later and still felt sick. Something felt different though. I glanced out the window and it was pouring again. It was worse than yesterday. Fog stuck to my window and I couldn't see more than 3 feet away from the house. Raindrops hit the leaves on the trees violently, causing them to thrash about. Our plans were ruined, once again. Just like yesterday, we stayed inside. We found more things to do. We dusted the shelves, we mopped the floor, we even rearranged the living room again. The 4th day. Rain would not stop hitting our roof. It was disgusting outside. We had no connection to the outside world. We hadn't even had time to hook up our cable or internet. It was too dangerous to go in the city, let alone have them come out to us. The roads were slippery and it was starting to flood. The rain felt like it was draining my energy, so I started staying in bed longer. The sixth day came, and the rain, it still poured. Thunder greeted us with a cackling laugh. We were running out of food, and my brother was starting to get more angry. We needed to get out, but we were trapped. The roads were flooded and we still had no connection to the outside world. We ran out of ways to rearrange the living room. I rolled out of bed around 1 in the afternoon. I felt so gloomy lately, and I hadn't had any energy to get out of bed. I sipped some orange juice and made myself some toast. My mother had stopped making breakfast. My father paced around the house. He was nervous for himself and our future. He hadn't gone into work since we got there. He was scared that he would be fired. But his co-workers were stuck inside due to the storm, right? The 11th day came, and nothing seemed to get better. The trees became bare from the wind. The sky was a murky, dark blue tint. We were all miserable. The last of our food sat on the kitchen table. We were so hungry. We needed to eat. We sat around the island and finished off what we had left. Finally, the 14th day came. My brother doesn't come out of his room anymore. He just lays in his bed, his eyes never blinking. As always, his headphones were plugged into his ears. I don't think he noticed his battery died 2 days ago. My father was lying on the couch. He didn't move. He didn't even make a sound. He had been lying there for a while then. Was he taking a nap? I'd never witnessed a grown man napping for that long. Myself, I sat beside my mother on the kitchen table. Her body felt cold and her eyes were shut. She laid her head down an hour ago and had stopped responding to my questions. I'd been living off the crumbs I could find in our garbage. Gross, I know, but what was I supposed to do? For the next few days, I sat beside each individual family member and talked to them. I talked to them about everything. My fears, my anxieties, about the new school year, and all the friends that I'd hoped I'd make. They never talked back. Just listened. It felt good to be listened to. I was sick, skinny with hunger. The house started to smell bad, but from what? We had no food left. What could be rotting? I tried to ask my mum what we should do. She never answered. The rain still poured. It never did stop. I needed fresh air. I needed to get away from that awful stench. Where could I go? It was a disaster outside. I shuffled to the door. I could barely hold myself up anymore. I turned the knob and opened it. The door creaked powerfully, and the floorboards underneath me creaked as I stepped outside to the front porch. I suddenly felt like I was in water. Everything was dripping all around me, almost like the world was melting. It was like I dove into the ocean. I took a few more steps until I was off my porch and on the grass. It felt slimy with the rain. I shut my eyes and took a deep breath. The air was damp, but it felt good going through my dry nostrils. I opened my eyes, and sunshine? It was like I stepped into a whole different world. The rain was gone. Actually, it was like it was never there. The trees were back to normal, with their crisp green leaves. The road was no longer flooded, and our grass was back to a nice bright green. Finally, the sky was light blue, and the sun was shining down on my face. I was confused, to say the least. It was hauntingly rainy before. Now, it looked like a drop of rain hadn't hit the floor in weeks. With the last energy I had in me, I shuffled to where the road started. I turned around, and my dry, red eyes grew wide. In front of me stood our new house. But it didn't look like the house that was there in the beginning. It looked rotted. It slumped down, almost like it couldn't hold up its own weight any longer. I remember seeing it move up and down, almost like it was taking deep breaths. I swear, my eyes were playing tricks on me. Water dripped from every part of the house, and the windows looked steamed, water droplets forming in them. The wood on the roof was starting to peel. I had no energy left. Just like the house, I couldn't hold myself up anymore. I knelt to my knees. I laid my head down on the warm road. It felt good against my cheek, and I could hear the house creaking loudly. I slowly closed my eyes. "Excuse me, miss? Excuse me?" I heard a voice, but I didn't have the strength to open my eyes. "Does she have a pulse?" I felt a cold finger press against my neck. "Barely. Do you think she'll make it?" "Let's hope to God that she does." I opened my eyes to find myself in a hospital bed. I was so weak, so skinny, I could barely keep my eyes open. A doctor stood in the corner of the room as he was speaking to a female nurse. "I can't believe she made it," the nurse sighed. "Yes, it was a miracle. She's in critical condition," he said, scribbling down things in a notebook. "Poor girl. Did you hear the sheriff? Her whole family died of starvation." She shifted her weight. She looked uneasy. "I just don't get it. They never even left the house when they got there. It's like they wanted to starve themselves." He glanced over at the window. "Did you hear the rumors? The sheriff went and investigated the fact that no one had heard from them since they moved to town. Everyone was buzzing about them, but they never showed up anywhere. I believe people were getting worried." She shifted again. "He found her family stuck to the floorboards of the house. He said it almost looked like the roots of a tree were growing into their veins." She hesitated and brought her voice down to a whisper. "They said the house was draining all their energy." "That's a load of bullshit," the doctor's voice chimed in. A little too high, I supposed. The nurse shushed him. "It's bullshit, just like the other stories of the family before them," the doctor whispered. "Yeah, but don't you think it's weird that it's the second time this has happened? We're lucky the girl survived." "Maybe this time we can get some answers," the doctor replied. I bobbed my head to the side lazily. It felt good to be around people again. It had been such a long time since I'd heard other humans speak outside of the house. I bobbed my head up again and forced my eyes open. "Oh look, she's awake," the nurse announced. Her expression changed and a smile played across her face. "Good morning. How you feeling?" I blinked my eyes and shook my head back and forth. "It seems you're still a little groggy." "That's alright. We'll get you feeling in top shape soon enough," she happily said. I blinked again and nodded as my head fell down. I felt so weak. I looked down at my narrow wrists. My veins popped out, a circuit of dark blue lines running up my arm. Then, in my dazed state, I noticed my veins throbbing. I focused and lifted my wrist close to my face. Protruding out of a vein was a tiny splinter, exactly the same color as the floorboards of my new house. I'll never forget the first paranormal experience I had. I was in 4th grade at a Catholic private school when Apple's iPod Touch first came out. It was extremely popular and I wanted one so bad. That Christmas, I did get one, along with a beautiful white desk. I was sitting on its matching chair in the corner of my room, where the desk was set up, when I decided to make a video using my brand new piece of Apple technology. As a kid, I was also really into YouTube. My favourite YouTubers included Michelle Fan, Bethany Mota, and Smosh, but that's beside the point. I'd always wanted to be a YouTuber, but the social media platform's rule was that the user had to be at least 13. I could have always lied, but the 10-year-old me would have responded to that with an indignant, "God wouldn't want me to do that." And so, I was making a poor quality video that would be shared with my friends through a school provided email account. I propped up my iPod on the base of a turned off desk lamp, and had hit record. "Hey everyone," I exclaimed with a dramatic hand gesture. I didn't really know who everyone was at the time, but that's how most famous YouTubers I watched carried on with their intros. So, why not? In summary, that horrible video was me over-dramatically reacting to a fireball. Fireballs were spicy little hard candies which had made an appearance in my stocking that year. Looking back, candy really wasn't even that hot, but I guess I had to be entertaining, just like my favourite online personalities. I popped the little red jawbreaker into my mouth and started to flail my arms, making inaudible noises and gestures to my mouth. Throughout filming, I remember seeing something out the corner of my eye in the corner of the iPod screen, which acted as a viewfinder while I recorded. After doing a classically drawn out farewell, I turned off the camera and plopped down onto my bed to watch the result. Excitement quickly turned to gut-wrenching fear when I saw what appeared to be a white t-shirt fluttering in and out of frame. It was as if someone held it above their head and blew hard on the end of it in order to make it flutter wildly. I probably wouldn't have been as frightened if I could find a logical explanation, but no fan was on, nobody was in my room, and I wasn't even sitting by a damn closet. I can't even say now that it was some kind of glare or trick played by the lighting of the room, because the opaque white fabric was unmissable and was as solid and clear as a person standing 2 inches from your face. I continued watching as growing dread gnawed at my insides. The fabric not only continued to flutter in and out of the frame, each time it was coming close to where I was sitting, but it appeared as if on camera my overhead light was flickering on and off. This never happened while I was filming. Then, it was as if something blew, because the room became blindingly bright. Again, this never physically happened while I was filming. When the camera finally recovered from the sudden exposure of light and began picking things up normally again, the piece of white fabric flew across the room and hit the wall behind me and crumpled to the floor. Nothing else happened throughout the duration of the video, and as soon as it ended, I looked up to where what looked like a t-shirt should have been laying. There was nothing there. Freaking out, I ran out of my room and downstairs into the living room where my parents were watching a movie. They noticed my facial expression along with pale skin and asked what had happened. I was too petrified to tell them. The next day, at my aunt's annual belated Christmas party, my cousins and I were all playing. I fished the new iPod Touch out of my pocket to show them the apps I'd downloaded, which led to me showing them the video that I still have in my camera roll. They told me that all of the occurrences were things any human could cause, and it was probably just my sister helping me out in order to prank them. I deleted the video that night, feeling like I was going insane. Our home is new, with no previous residents, so it couldn't have been ghosts. Throughout the next couple of years, I became accustomed to strange dreams, unexplainable sounds, apparitions, and the feeling of someone watching me. I wrote these off as coincidences or paranoia. Now, I'm 16, and I'd just recently gone on a trip to New York with my mother and our neighbour. Somehow, a casual conversation over my lunch at dinner led into the paranormal, and I'd brought up what happened to me many years ago. My mum laughed and shrugged it off, but my neighbour looked at me oddly. "What?" I asked, taking a sip of my root beer. Candice told us years ago that she made friends with a man who owned a farm where we lived. Our neighbour replied. Candice was their youngest daughter. I furrowed my eyebrows and asked her for an elaboration. "Our neighbourhood is built on the remnants of an orchard," she said. it wouldn't necessarily be uncommon for a farmhouse to be there too. I pondered a story as our food arrived. I was just surprised someone else had weird experiences as well. She shrugged as a burger was sat in front of her. After we got home from New York, I told my dad about our conversation and asked if he knew anything. He appeared as if I'd struck a nerve and launched into a story of a man who had owned the orchard that our neighbourhood was built on. He'd actually refurbished a barn to make it livable for him and his family. How did he die? I asked apprehensively. He was in a tractor accident, Dad replied. But he survived. I looked at him oddly as if to say, I asked how he died, not how he almost died. Dad rolled his eyes and continued. His injuries were so bad that he was bedbound and had to be taken care of by his wife. One day, he didn't want to bother her, so he decided to change clothes himself. As he was taking off his shirt, his spleen ruptured. I internally reeled back in shock, remembering the t-shirt in the video. How do you know this shit? I asked incredulously. He was my great uncle, Dad replied with a sigh. I had what many people would call a warped childhood. Many children are raised on nursery rhymes, fairy tales and Dr. Seuss. And while my childhood did have these memories, my mother included another genre in mine and my sister's upbringing: horror. I cannot count the number of times when my sister and I were read some of Stephen King's short stories for bedtime, rather than a more common children's story. Popsy was always my favourite. I grew up watching the classic horror movies and being told ghost stories. Many people, when I tell them this, ask me if I had a lot of nightmares as a child as a result. But the truth is quite the opposite. I was not afraid of bogeymen or ghosts. To me, ghosts and goblins were simply fictional creatures that are only in books, movies, and stories told around a campfire. The horror genre was simply part of my life. I loved the feeling of being scared. So, naturally, Halloween was one of my favourite times of year. I remember one Halloween many years ago. I was young, but not so young that I don't have first-hand memories of the events that soon follow. There was a Halloween attraction that was running just down the street from our house. It had been going on every Halloween for a few years, but my parents had never let my sister and I go before. And then, one year, we were finally given permission to go to this haunted attraction. The attraction was built into an old and abandoned manor house, just the sort of place you would expect to find a Halloween attraction to be built. I remember being very excited as I waited to get into the house, because lots of people that were coming out were raving about how scary it was, and I was highly anticipating having my own time inside. Like most Halloween attractions, they let people inside the house in small groups. Because my sister and I were only children, the attendants at the door made sure that we were put in the same group as our parents. Finally, we stepped inside. Inside, it could have been any haunted house in America in the 90s, full of fake fog and grease-painted actors. I wasn't overly scared because my mother always reminded me that the actors aren't allowed to touch you. But I jumped and screamed along with everyone else when a monster jumped out of the hidden nooks and crannies in the old manor house. Eventually, we made our way down to the basement, which had been changed into the stereotypical mad doctor setting common in most haunted houses. Needless to say, there was a lot of fake blood everywhere. But I'll never forget that basement because something seemed just a little out of place. Sometimes, even the most normal things can become diabolical if you alter the perspective. It's something you see in a few modern ghost hunting shows in the B-rolls. There was nothing that immediately jumped out as being evil. There was certainly nothing like The Exorcist happening to tip me off that something was wrong. It was a simple sight, but that made it much more unnerving because it stood out against the overt horror backdrop of the decorated room. In the midst of the bloody carnage of the Mad Doctor's operating room, I remember that an old woman was sitting in the far corner of the room. She looked to be in her 80s and had thinning grey hair and was very thin. I would be lying to myself if I said that she didn't scare me more than the rest of the attraction combined. At the time, I didn't have much understanding of the effects the different physical ailments could have on a person, but looking back now, I would say that she was the victim of a bad stroke. Sometimes a bad stroke will leave the person with one side of his or her face paralyzed, and that's exactly what happened to her. One side of her face was drooping and saliva was leaking from the corner of her drooped mouth. She was talking, yelling at us as we passed by. Her words were badly slurred because of her paralyzed face. I could make out what she was yelling. Stop! Get out! Over and over again. Even passing through the basement and going out the other side, I could still hear her screaming in that awful slurred way up the stairs. I was extremely disturbed by the sight of the old woman, but as I got away from her, I began to feel better. She was obviously an actor who was working for the attraction. Most of the attraction worked on jump scares, and she was obviously there to cater to the more psychological horror. Well, in any case, it worked. It certainly worked on me. We emerged out into the night once again, and got that instant sense of relief that makes horror so addicting. The "we have survived" moment. My sister instantly began to talk about which part was her favourite. An actor who jumped out at her in a werewolf costume had been her favourite. When it came my turn to share, I could think of nothing besides the old woman I'd seen, and told my family about how the old woman in the basement scarred me the most. "What woman in the basement, Ashley?" my mother asked. Shocked, I began to describe as well as I could what I had seen. When I had finished, my mother said that she hadn't seen any woman fitting that description down in the basement, and the rest of my family agreed with her. I put the incident out of my mind. Like I said, I didn't believe in ghosts, and I didn't believe that they were real. I tried to rationalize why they had missed the old woman in her screams. Each attempt to do this was more pathetic than the last, but I knew that ghosts couldn't be real. The next year, I was eager to step foot on the Old Manor again, but I was horrified to discover that the haunted attraction had been shut down and would not be opening again. Since I lived so close to the haunt, a few people in my neighbourhood had taken up jobs there, and I asked around with them about why it closed. The few people that would talk to me told me that the old manor house was really haunted with real ghosts, and that too many people were refusing to work there again because of the paranormal activity going on there. Their stories ranged from objects moving on their own, to apparitions, and even to physical attacks against the living that entered certain parts of the house. I laughed it off. People were just letting the atmosphere of the Halloween haunt mess with them. It was probably just a couple of pranksters messing with the workers. But no matter how much I tried to explain to the workers about how it could be a couple of jokers messing around, they kept insisting that it was impossible for it to have been any human activity. But even as I tried to convince them, I couldn't help but remember the old woman that I'd seen in the basement that no one else had seen. I was kind of nervous about the whole thing, and I wanted more information about the house. These days, you can look up anything on the internet and have an answer in the seconds. But in the 90s, it wasn't like that. Few people had internet at the time, and my family was one that did not have internet access. So I went to the next best thing, my mother. I asked her about the old manor house, and at first, she was reluctant to tell me, which unnerved me more than anything else because she'd never shied away from telling us things of that nature before. Finally, she told me what she knew. The manor started out as a private residence built in 1922, but the original owner lost the house in foreclosure. After that, it became a sanitarium, which is something like a small hospital. Just by virtue of being a hospital in an area where there was only one hospital around at the time, a lot of people passed away in the walls. In fact, there are some reports that say that there was at least one death a day within those walls during this time. But that wasn't even the part my mother was reluctant to tell me. She told me that afterward, it was turned into a nursing facility, and that they would have taken care of sick older people just like the old woman I had seen during my walkthrough. But the records of abuse that came out of that place is numerous. Many ex-employees confessed that they quit soon after being hired because of the vast amount of malpractice that happened there. My mother remembered all of this because it was in the newspapers when it was going on, and it was a huge deal in the community. It made me feel a little sick to think about how those people, those human beings, were treated in that horrible place. And that's not all. Local legend has long said that the building was haunted by the tortured souls of the people who died under the horrible conditions there. The man who built the Halloween attraction there knew of the history and the legends surrounding the place, and built the attraction with the sole purpose of playing off those stories. It was then that I knew that I had seen the ghost of a woman who had died in that building. She just wanted to spend her afterlife in peace. But instead, every year, she and her fellow ghosts were interrupted by the living storming through their place in the thousands, turning their situation into a joke. And for the first time ever, I began to treat ghosts and spirits not as fictional creatures only meant to frighten and scare, but as a real physical manifestation of a force that humans are not capable of understanding yet. The house, to this day, continues to be a hotspot for paranormal activity. The owner lets in local paranormal groups at least once a week, every Friday night to do an investigation. Several ghost-themed television shows are filmed at the location. One show brought in a psychic medium who claims that the years of the house spent as a Halloween attraction has forever scarred the house and the spirits who reside here. One thing is for sure. I'm now a lot more careful about checking out the history of any Halloween haunt I go to. Ghosts are everywhere, of course, but I'll never go to a place with such a sad history attached to it. And I haven't even been able to get scared inside a Halloween attraction since. I don't scream, jump, or run away as the actors jump out at me. Nearly all my friends have commented on my bravery in the face of these Halloween attractions. But I'm not brave. Not really. It's just a lack of fear. Because it's hard to get scared by actors in makeup when you've been inside the real thing. I don't think I can explain it, but I have an irrational fear of windows, and I'll try my best to explain. When I was a child, I would have the kind of dreams that would be enough to torment me. I'm not sure why I remember this just now, but one of the dreams had involved a window. Most of them did, to be more clear. And to be precise, it wasn't the kind of dream you would just wake up and think, that was a dream. That was a dream. It was the kind of thing where you would wake up and mentally ask yourself, why me? But have no explanation for yourself either because you were tired, but never pushed yourself to think, maybe that happened. Maybe I'm curiously devoted to a window or something like that. There was one that I remember somewhat vividly. One that I had back when I was living with just my siblings and my grandmother. It was a rough, dark summer night, and I, like always, had helped my siblings with creating the bed on the floor of the trailer before settling down for the night, just watching some television before drifting off to sleep. My grandmother didn't have enough change to buy a house, nor buy separate beds. She also didn't have enough change to buy materials so she could willingly add on to the trailer so that we could all sleep in separate rooms. So that meant that we had to create a bed on the floor in the living room out of blankets, pillows and towels. Looking back, I can't see what we found wrong with the rooms at the end of the hall. It was a rough night, let me remind you, and it was warm, so that led to night terrors for me. I was the worst of the four of us that would have the night terrors, and I never knew why. Curiosity didn't seem like something to blame, nor darkness, nor sleep deprivation, and don't even get me started on morbidity. The dream started off fairly simple, and this is as best as I can describe it. It started off with me walking along the flower bed outside a large lit and well-kept house, I eventually laid down in the flower bed, as the wind blew past me and ruffled my shallow locks. I kept myself relatively clean at all times, and I still somewhat do, so it was no surprise that I got up willingly and checked my dark shorts and light shirt for any grass burns, as I remember falling sometime in the dream before that, even though there were no mentions of this in my dream. My dream persona straightened his back and walked towards the house. There was a curious head in the window, notably the dream persona's mother, who had smiled when noticing him. The persona put his hands in his pockets before reaching to the doorknob and pushing the door open, all while greeting his mother as she pranced to the door and scooped him up, teasing about his short height and how careless he was out in the front yard, much like mothers tend to do. Instead of the persona smiling and hugging his mother, he frowned and pouted. She poked his nose and let him go, as he went to his room rather calmly, as it was an early afternoon and he needed to relax and play video games, much like children do. I always had a fear of windows, as I mentioned, and the dream persona shrunk to prevent having to look over the window at the end of the hall, shivering slightly as he did out of the sheer terror from the window. Although his fear about it was notably different from mine. Whereas mine was a minor phobia, like my fear of water and heights, he loathed windows, so much so that he forced himself to keep the blinds in his room shut at all times, and to tape them shut to prevent them from moving. It stayed like that for a while in the dream, really because my dreams were somewhat consecutive. All of them were 5 days apart from each other, it would seem. Anyway, back on point. He made it to his room and made sure the tape was steady, shaking all the while when he had to peer out of the window in the middle of the day. It was worse at night though. A gust of wind behind the blinds wafted them up, snapping the tape as they did, causing my dream persona, my doppelganger, to flinch, his eyes beginning to fill with tears, before the room in the dream changed. He wasn't in anything drastic like a torture chamber or the trunk of a vehicle underneath dirt or in a coffin. It just transitioned to another location, a trailer, like I used to have, randomly. The windows separated and was much shorter, so it was just two small windows, consecutive and in place with one another. The child cried, uncaring for what happened to the window, but instead for his mother. What came instead was not the boogeyman, and it was not some irrational creature. It was just an elderly lady with the same features as his mother. He looked at his mother and dashed into her arms. "Mummy, Mummy, the window's open! Mummy, remember that nest outside? The window's open, I could hear the bees, Mummy! Mummy, the window's open! I can see the outside!" The elderly lady rubbed his back with the wrinkled, rough hands. "It's okay, honey. Don't worry. Mummy will solve the problem." And that's what she tried to do. The child got off and sat to the side, watching like a vicarious animal, waiting for the strike. The lady withdrew a wooden spoon and a knife, before cutting down the nest and hitting off the remaining supports. The bees exited the nest, clearly agitated, and attacked the lady, stinging various parts of her face and arm. Within due time, 6 maggots had been released on her arms, biting at the deceased's skin, and at least 30 bees were attacking her, like a pack of hungry lions. The lady tried to push the window closed, and succeeded, on her arm. With gravity and death working against her, the window closed enough to catch her arm. There was a sickening snap of tendons and a tear in flesh, before the lady fell on the child's bed, without an arm, and with 34 bees on her face. She was deathly allergic to bees after all. I woke up then, reminded of my mother's fear and allergy of bees. Well, I guess that's my explanation. And remember, I have an irrational fear of windows. My name is Giovanni, and I'm writing this because I think I've gone mad, and I want someone else to either confirm or disprove this. I'm not a writer, so I'm not going to try any fancy writing or anything like that. I'm just going to tell you what I'm going through. When I look into mirrors, I can see a demon. I first saw it 3 days ago, on the 1st of October. I recently discovered the horror genre in general, and have been watching films such as Wreck and playing through Amnesia. It's more to prove my bravery than anything else. I've had amnesia for 3 years, and have never made it very far. I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't a coward or something. After a few weeks, I decided to do something a little more real. Real with massive air quotes around it. I've always been a skeptic. I decided to go through the whole Bloody Mary thing. I lit a candle, placed it in front of a mirror, switched out lights, and said the name. Nothing happened. I wasn't disappointed. It was what I was expecting. However, the atmosphere in the room was bloody amazing. So I sat there a while, staring into the mirror. And then, my face began to change. It wasn't gradual. After about a minute, the face looking back at me wasn't mine. Although it resembled me, it had horns, and its eyes were pure black. It took me a good 10 seconds to register what I was looking at. After I threw myself at the light switch, when I nerved myself to look in the mirror again, my face was once again my own. I didn't sleep well that night. The next day, I decided to try again. I thought that I'd been seeing things, an understandable conclusion to make. I lit a candle, turned off the lights, and stared into the mirror. After 1 minute, I saw it again. It wasn't exactly the same as it was the first time. The face bulges in different places whenever I look at it, but it was close enough. I wasn't so scared this time. Actually, I'm surprised I didn't freak out. The face made me feel uneasy. It was looking at me as if it wished to do harm, but it couldn't do anything. I sat there for a good quarter of an hour, studying the face. It shifted the entire time, bulging and receding. I turned on the light and left the room. I decided to do some experiments. As I said, I'm a skeptic. I don't believe in the supernatural, so I decided that there had to be a rational explanation for what was happening. It sounded to me like schizophrenia. I know very little about this, but I know it makes you hallucinate. However, although I don't believe in ghosts, demons, God, or anything like that, I like to be sure. I found under what situations the face was best seen. Turns out that a standard household lamp placed behind you with the mirror half a meter from your face is best. I then asked my friend to do what I had done. He, being a fan of Creepypasta and stuff like this, agreed. He saw a face too. It wasn't a demon this time. It was his mother. Well, almost. He said that she looked wrong, but that she appeared happy. He then told me that he didn't want to talk about this anymore, and he left. Now I don't know what to think. Schizophrenia, as far-fetched as it may seem, was the only logical explanation I had. Now others are saying that they can see something like what I can see. I need help from others. I'm writing this so I can post it on No Sleep, Creepypasta wikis, and anywhere else that would make sense. I'm putting them there because the people who frequent those sites are more likely to actually try something like this out. I know that half the shitty stories you find on these sites have the whole, no really this happened thing, and then no one believes them. But I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you just to try it out. Turn the lights off, place a lamp on the floor behind you, and stand about half a meter from the mirror. Stare into it for a few minutes, and then tell me what you see. The court gave us joint custody. I had custody of Jim, my son, for the weekdays, and the crazy bitch I used to call a wife gets him on weekends. I contested as much as I could, because I knew that she was abusive. But the court still bought the idea of her as the victim because she's a woman and this country is still sexist as fuck. So I had to work with Jim as much as I could, ask him about everything that had happened so I could undo any damage. And no, it wasn't pleasant. I tried to press charges against that bitch several times, but apparently calling your own son a worthless piece of shit for moving your vodka is a valid form of parenting in Maine. It started off relatively straightforward. I picked Jim up on Monday morning and brought him back to the old cabin near the lake that I inherited from my father. Then I returned him on Saturday to the wretched whore's apartment. The cabin was old. I loved the shit out of it, and so did he. 2 stories, built from scratch by my grandfather. It was a cozy place to live. My son, the silly cat that my ex-wife was too inept to keep, and my old dog, Max, were all I had outside of work. But my boss needed me more and more as time went on from the divorce, because the business was so close to finding investors. I should have quit. I kept telling myself that we were almost there, just a little bit longer, but it kept dragging on. The bad shit started around his 6th birthday. By this point, I saw him for 2 hours every day, maybe 3 including dropping him off at school, and he was seeing more of the wretched abyss that used to be a mother. I managed to take that day off to stay at home. I called off the babysitter and set up a little birthday cake I bought him with a few gifts. I remember him opening the presents as the 6 candles on the cake lit the waxed wooden walls with a pale orange. He smiled and thanked me, but I could tell something was off. There's something unimaginably depressing about seeing your son take that toy truck he wanted, take it upstairs to his little bedroom in the wooden loft, and place it in his toy box, before laying down in his bed and taking a nap. I couldn't imagine why he would be tired at 2 in the afternoon, other than that wretched whore draining his mood. I spent a lot of time over the next few days at work trying to get social services to investigate the mother, but excuses as to why they wouldn't were as inconsistent as they were numerous. It's hard to explain why this was depressing to me, but there's an instinct you get as a parent when every toy in your 6-year-old's toy box stays in the exact same position, including the brand new truck that you asked for, and there's nothing else you could be doing. That's the instinct I got, which kept me calling the social services. But a week after his birthday, I was able to take another day off work and go home early when my boss had to go to a doctor's appointment. And this was when things got strange. I came home and found that the babysitter, Jessica, a 20-year-old from Bangor, seemed to spend her time sitting in her car listening to god-awful rap music and talking to her friends, rather than, actually watching my son. I told her to leave on the spot, saying that I'll be sending her last check by mail. When I came inside, my old retriever Max, rather than greeting me like he would usually, merely barked towards the back door and only acknowledged my existence for a moment. I walked across the open cabin floor to the back door, and the door was ajar. I heard the sound of Jim crying upstairs. "What's wrong?" I asked. Jim said, in the half-crying voice that young children do, "Keto ran away." Keto was the cat that my wife had treated poorly, and I had become close to that cat after the ex-wife left, especially since that he'd always remind me that he could undo what she had done. I left the cabin with him to search for the silly cat, to no avail. We searched for hours until we had to go to bed. I even went back and searched more after taking him to his mother's, telling Jim that I would keep trying. It's hard to explain how as a grown man I can be saddened to the point of tears by a missing cat, but this was certainly the case. I just wanted to see him again, and for everything to be normal, but I just couldn't find him. Jim's behaviour continued to be depressing, even after I hired a new babysitter. The new babysitter was a woman named Cara. She was around 28 and seemed nice enough, and promised not to pull something like the other babysitter. I trusted her, despite getting the feeling that she was a lot like the last babysitter, and continued with my work. A few weeks had passed and Jim continued behaving strangely, not using any sort of toys, hiding uneaten food in the trash, and generally acting jaded. I decided to cut the shit at this point and told my boss that I was going to leave work at 5 PM, and if he fires me for it, then so be it. That talk was a success, and he agreed to let me go home given the circumstances of my son, but this proved to be too late. I should have done that long before. First day I took off at 5 PM. I didn't tell the babysitter I would be home before 9 PM, and came home to find that my instinct was right. There she was, in a black sedan, sitting with her seat back, listening to something akin to someone wrapping a washing machine with a brick in it. Her floorboard was littered with half-eaten food and a jar of solidified peanut butter with my missing butter knife laid visible by a dash. She apologized and said that it was just for a minute, but the evidence about her car told me that it was a lie. I fired her too, and at that moment I decided that I would just put my son in after-school care and bypass these god-awful babysitters. This time, I entered the house, and once again my son was crying and the back door was ajar. This time, Max wasn't present at all. The old dog was neither there to greet me with a wagging tail, nor there to bark at the door. That dog and my son were the only two in my life that I couldn't imagine living without. And now, he was missing. I figured that he must be going in and out as the babysitter sat in the front driveway, listening to a sound equivalent of vomit while texting away, and so letting the animals out in the process. I consoled him for only a moment, before looking for the dog. Unlike the cat, this was not the first time the dog had made it for the door. Max typically went out and wandered for a little bit, and then returned home. He'd spent the majority of his time marking every tree around, so he shouldn't have really been hard to find, but we just couldn't find him. He didn't come home later like he usually did, and he was nowhere in sight. This was as confounding to me as it was saddening. How does a dog disappear suddenly? And why was my son crying this time, when the last time he got out, my son seemed okay with it? Something didn't add up. I took Jim back to his mother, who still seemed shaken by the missing dog. I came back home using every fibre of my being to hope that I would come home to a frustrated looking retriever sitting by the front door, or maybe walk inside and find the back door ajar again with the dog sitting on his bed. But this wasn't the case. He was still missing. I entered the old cabin after dropping him off and began investigating closer. The first place I investigated was Jim's room. His messy single bed was against the wall, with his small dresser beside it, and the toy box at the foot. The toy box was an old transparent bin. I could see through it, and the fire truck that I bought him remained on top of the pile, with the rest of it unchanged from weeks ago. I should have noticed this earlier. The idea deeply concerned me because there really wasn't anything else the kid could be doing other than watching television. So that's where I went. I figured that if I want to find out what my son has been doing, despite the fact that when I ask every night what he did today, he says, "I played a lot and had such and such for lunch." The television was paused on an episode of Top Gear. I remembered that I hadn't actually touched the television since I started working in human hours, and the last thing I ever watched was an episode of Top Gear, which I paused. So, my son can't have been watching television, unless he has a thing for watching a still image of a week-old episode. I also found it odd that there was a bit of fishing wire next to the television, but I didn't think much else of it. At that point, I figured he must have been playing with the animals and somehow in the midst of things let them out. But that only explained how the cat got out, not why the dog disappeared. Max wouldn't just disappear like that, especially not in a northeastern forest where the only thing you could come across is a moose. I walked to the back door to see if there was anything there. It was a thick wooden door with a window on it, and had a slight problem with the latch. The latch made this door easy to open but difficult to close. It seems logical that if Jim opened the door to go outside, he might have trouble shutting it. He was allowed outside, just not far into the forest that surrounded the house and the yard. I wandered out in the backyard to see if I could find anything else about where the dog went. There was some foul smell and I wasn't sure what it was, though I didn't really think much of it at the time. I looked past the dark wooden porch into the forest, and despite the fact that this was morning, and the forest was beautiful in the autumn light, part of me, being a fan of horror stories and creepypastas, expected to see a shadowy figure or some demonic ritual especially with that off smell. But there was nothing. But while on that train of thought, I did notice something about the fishing equipment I kept on the back porch. One of the spools of fishing wire was missing, and I didn't remember taking it. Why would Jim need a spool of fishing wire? I wondered. I recalled finding it odd that there was a bit of fishing wire by the television and moved back to it. And indeed, there was fishing wire by the television. I picked it up and got a closer look, feeling like a detective on a mission to find the lost dog. I put it up to the light, childishly imagining myself on some sort of crime drama. That's when I saw it. At the very end of the wire was a small patch of 2 or 3 black hairs at the very end. Both Jim and I have red hair, and Max was a golden retriever. But Keto was a pitch black cat. I didn't know what to think of it other than he must have been doing something with the cat. But that thought was cut short when I looked into the kitchen. There was a huge metal trash can that I used for the kitchen which rustled towards the side, to where the lid was opening perpendicular to the wall, whereas it was supposed to be parallel. I knew that the trash can was too heavy for Jim to easily move, so I began thinking about what could have caused it. And then I realized, the most logical thing that could cause the trash can to move like that? Old Max backing up into it. He's just the right size to get the torque on the trash can if you were backing into it. But he would only back into it if, every once in a while, we get an idea that seems outlandish but makes perfect sense based on everything that's happened. This was one of those ideas, and the feeling I got from it was one of both clarity and an unimaginable feeling of hopelessness and dread. Old Max would have backed up into the trash can, moving it about, if he were trying to get something off his head. I've seen him move like that when I jokingly put a sock over his nose and watch him back up and pull it off with his paw. But if he had something around his face or neck, then he would back up. Something like a spool of fishing wire. It was such a wretched but sensible idea. Constant abuse from his mother, never seeing his father, neglecting his mother. Jim has been using his time on nothing. He could have been taking his frustration out on the only things that he could. Keto and Max. But Keto was a large cat for himself, and Max was huge for a retriever. Jim was far too small to overpower Keto, let alone Max. But he's not too small to tighten a knot on a trusting animal. I got an image of my head, of poor Keto with fishing line around his neck trying to get loose, and an even worse one of old Max trying to pour off the fishing line, backing up into the trash can just trying to get loose. If this idea, outlandish as it is, were to be true, then I might never find Keto. But old Max is far too heavy for a 6-year-old to get far with him. And that's when I remembered the foul smell on the back porch. I wandered to the back porch and found the bravery to look under. A pair of dead, pale white eyes looked back at me, with the autumn sun lighting up his fur. Around poor Max's neck was some of the missing fishing wire. I immediately threw up, and I can't remember how much I reacted until the point where I got in the car. Of all the emotions I was feeling at the time, anger was the strongest. Not towards Jim, but towards the whore. The only reason Jim would have for doing something like this was as a reflection of whatever his mother is doing on the weekends. With how fast I was driving, it's sheer luck that I didn't wreck or even get pulled over. Strangely, I wasn't angry at Jim, but sorry that I helped turn him into this. And there I was, a little ghetto duplex in the city, with trash bags sitting on her front porch, evident of her laziness, and windows that hadn't been cleaned in so long that you couldn't even see inside. I should have called the police, but I just wanted to get Jim out there. She never locked her front door, so I simply walked in and yelled her name. "Michelle!" I said. No response. "Jim!" I continued, also to no avail. The absolute mess of the apartment would appall me if I could think of anything other than Jim, Keto, and old Max. But the smell of cigarette smoke and spilled vodka still filled the air of a filthy, rundown duplex. I looked to the living room. The television was muted, and the cigarettes were out. So she must have been in the backyard. The only thing we had in common was a love for gardening. So despite her wretched laziness, she still kept a little garden in the back. And that's where I headed next. As I approached the dusty old back door of her garden, Jim ran through the door. His young hands were holding an empty spool of fishing wire. He began crying. I grabbed him as tight as I could and told him, "It's not your fault." The door was ajar. The hand arrived without warning. It was somewhat human-like in appearance, but its skin looked like snow and rotting flesh. It had nails. No. Colossal claws, which were oh so sharp. They were like gigantic needles used to sew the world together. It was a great big horrific thing, and my house sat in its palm. I know this is true. It was like God, in that most could not see it, and that I truly do believe it could destroy me. Also, I prayed to it. It showed up on Tuesday, June 6th. I went off to work in the morning, and when I returned home, there it was. A gigantic hand wrapped tightly around my shitty yellow house. I felt uneasy looking at it, but I was not surprised. It seemed as natural, as if it should be there, as my own hands should be at the end of my wrists. I think now that that was its influence. Even more strangely, no one else took any notice of it. It seemed to be entirely beyond their vision, beyond what could be accepted as truth. Its large thumb blocked my doorway. As I approached, it moved slightly, allowing me entry, only to shift back into place once I had closed the door again. I was uneasy that evening. If I had an urge to contact the police or anyone else, the hand silenced it in my mind without me knowing. I tried to turn on the TV in my bedroom, but there was nothing but static. I attempted to watch some videos on my laptop, only to find no available Wi-Fi. Upon journeying to my kitchen for a late night snack, I found all the food was missing. Even then, the power of the creature, if you could call it that, was too strong. I didn't know the terror that I was faced with. I shrugged away these small oddities and went to sleep. My alarm clock went off at 7 the following morning. I turned it off and quickly got dressed with a lot of time to spare due to a lack of breakfast. I intended to get to work early and fill out some paperwork I had gotten behind on. When I went to leave, the doorway was not only blocked by the monstrosity, but the thumb had actually torn through the oak door and was now scratching with its gigantic talon against my ceiling. I tried to push past it, but one touch of its skin and I fell to the floor, convulsing as a painful electrical buzz ran through my body. I picked myself up from the ground and returned almost mindlessly to my bed. The bedroom door was open, and it slammed shut without me so much as touching it as soon as I had entered. I collapsed, face first into my mattress. I understood then. The fear filled me, and I accepted reluctantly that in that moment I would be soon dead. I didn't move from that spot until well past sunset. I walked from room to room, looking for an escape. I checked and double-checked my phone for service, but I was without any means of contacting the outside world. Days passed, and there was no change. I still had tap water to live off, even if it did taste very bitter and was difficult to keep down. I was in hell in that house within the hand. I don't know how much time passed. I grew thin. I grew insane. There were points where the only thing which was real to me was the hand. I worshipped it. I built altars of rat bones to it. My body was dying. I could feel it with every breath. I was being absorbed into the hand. I would sometimes crawl on all fours down to the cold, damp basement and sit for hours in total darkness. There at least, I could barely feel its playful fingers picking apart my mind. I went down into the darkness so many times. Each and every time, I was prepared to die there and end my misery. Eventually, when I had survived long past the capabilities of any human, I concluded that I would never die. At least not in this house. This was an inescapable and insufferable. I accepted that any semblance of happiness or normality that I'd ever experienced was now over. The hand had won. And I think that's what it had been trying to do. Destroy me. Even briefly before I made my escape, I couldn't have even dreamed of doing so. One night, I just found myself unable to sleep in my bedroom. The hand was projecting visions in my mind. I can't bring myself to reveal the specifics. My captor's strength was too powerful in this part of the house. I took my comforter and flashlight and walked down to the basement, trying to get some sleep, even if it meant shivering for hours on a cold concrete floor. I made my way down to the creaky basement steps and found myself in an almost empty, dust-filled room. There was one object in that room which remained from my mother. It was a large chest of drawers, which had been painted white by a family friend before my grandmother was ever born. I was an only child, and my mother left it as well as the rest of her house for me in the will. The paint was chipped badly now. It looked as if a light breeze could knock it to pieces. Still, it was one of my mother's only valued possessions. I'd taken special care to keep it since making the home my own. It had stayed in the exact same spot for 4 years before the hand arrived. It just so happens that on the night I'm telling you about, I turned to face the chest of drawers and pointed the beam of my flashlight in its direction. In that split second, I noticed a dim glint of metal in the space between the antique and the floor which it sat on. I did something which I had not done in a long time. I allowed myself to hope. I hoped that I knew the shape and colour. I hoped that the can still held its intended contents. I hoped that my mother's leftover supply of kerosene would be enough. All that hope filled me with energy and compelled me to jump forward like a crazed animal. The chest of drawers fell on the ground as I slammed into it. As would be expected, it broke into many pieces. There on the ground was a black metal can, now coated in rust. The label was yellow and barely legible. After a moment of intense scrutiny, I knew for certain that the can indeed read kerosene. I shook it to check if it had been emptied. It was almost full. I dashed upstairs and grabbed a box of matches from the drawer in the kitchen. I ran from room to room, throwing the liquid on almost every flammable surface. Finally, when I was convinced that the house would surely burn, I poured the remainder of the bottle on my head. I felt so alive, despite the cold and destruction I was bringing about to myself. I reached into the pocket of my sweatpants, took out the box of matches. There were about a dozen of them. The first few I went to light slipped from my fingers and sunk into and beneath the wooden floor as if it didn't exist at all. I knew that the hand was fighting back. I concentrated as much as I could to keep the matches in my grip and light them as quickly as possible. This simply led to 5 or 6 more simply snapping between my digits. I looked at the box in my left hand, and I saw only one small wooden match remaining. "Fuck," I said aloud, before taking a deep breath and closing my eyes as I ran the final match calmly against the box strike pad. I felt the heat in my hand and quickly bent down to set the carpet alight. It burned, and so did I. The house filled with smoke, it then blazed and crumbled. The fire consumed much of my flesh. Somehow, I was still awake and alive when a wall came crashing down in a small room to my left. I saw daylight and freedom. Rising with a force of will I wasn't aware I possessed, I stumbled my way out of the nightmare. My body collapsed onto the hot pavement outside, and the flames which were consuming my flesh were immediately extinguished by a harsh wind. I could hear the house falling into itself behind me. Still, I couldn't bring myself to look back. The agony of what happened was too fresh in my mind. They have me in a small hospital room. It smells like detergent and death. Then again, maybe that's me. I try not to look at myself much. It's not a pretty sight. There's a calendar on my wall by the window. It says Wednesday, June the 7th. It's been less than a day since I first saw the hand. The doctors say my body is so starved, it's uncertain whether I can recover. And the burns don't exactly help my chances. But I don't really care about any of this. Not really. What I care about is what's outside the window. The hands. There are so many of them. Almost everywhere has one, I think. No one sees though. That is, unless they want to be seen. I was just 9 years old when my mum, my dad, and I moved into a small neighborhood in St. Augustine, Florida. I felt strange when I hopped out of the moving van, because I didn't know why we relocated from our native town of Jacksonville, or how my mother even found this town. I was very apathetic about moving into such a small town. There weren't many children around my age. I felt closed in, and my house looked old and creepy. I was thinking that this was the worst neighborhood anyone could possibly live in. As 2 weeks passed by, I actually started to enjoy living in this small town. I started to make new friends who were my own age. My friends and I went swimming at each other's houses. We also had sleepovers quite frequently. Just when I thought things were perfect, that's when strange events started to happen. The first unusual thing that happened was when I was getting ready for bed. While getting my evening apparel on, I started hearing strange noises from my closet. I stopped putting my pajamas on for a second and looked into my closet. I shrugged the noises off as being the house creaking, being as it was an old house. When I was done getting my pajamas on, I put a movie in and fell asleep 20 minutes into the movie. I woke up at midnight to more weird noises coming from my closet. I shrugged it off again because when you're little, your mind plays tricks on you. The second night was one of the most terrifying. I remember closing my closet door before I went to bed in hopes of drowning out the noises. However, I woke up to a loud bang at 1 AM. I sprang awake and turned to my closet, seeing that it was open. I looked into the blackness of my closet, and what I saw was so demented that I could never erase it from my mind. I saw 2 big red eyes. These eyes glowed bright red, and when you looked into them, you saw a whole other world. A world that was simply evil. I tried to scream and look away, but I was controlled by a whole other force. Its eyes then changed colour, and a picture took form. What I saw in the picture was the face of my dead brother. My brother's name was Mike. He died in his bedroom on the day of his 16th birthday from unnamed causes when I was just 7. When the picture went away, it sprang out of my closet and jumped to the foot of my bed. It put its green, slimy finger on my lips and darkly whispered, "Thomas, come with me." It then smiled at me, exposing 3 rows of large, sharp teeth. Its long pointed nose was stabbing at me in my forehead, and the thing reached out its slimy arm and started to stroke my blonde hair. I tried my best to scream, but all I produced was a small squeak. "How do you know my name?" I choked as I trembled in my bed. "I know every child's name, Thomas." Just then, the creature listed off children's names, such as Rick Commons, Sage Michaels, Susie French, Alex Fournier, and the most shocking one of all, Mike Sanders. "Now, come with me." It grabbed my wrist and started to drag me to the eternal blackness of my closet. It was then that I finally let out a huge scream. The creature let go of my wrist and jumped back into my closet. My parents ran into my room in their robes. "Thomas, are you okay?" my mum asked as she ran in to pick me up off the floor. I explained my experience, and my mum just blew it off as a dream relating to the depression of losing my brother. My dad tucked me in, and they both went to sleep. The next morning, my parents went to go pay some bills. I went up to my room and looked in the closet for the creature, but it wasn't there. When my parents came back, they told me that we were going to visit my brother's grave in Jacksonville. When we got to the graveyard, I noticed that the first couple of tombstones I saw were the names of the kids that the creature listed off. My brother was right in the middle of them. Thank you for listening to the end. If you enjoyed today's video, don't forget to click that like button, and if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and tap the bell icon to make sure you never miss a story.